Morning, everybody. I'll just give it a couple of moments whilst people are logging on and joining us. Whilst people are joining, I'd just like to give you all a very warm welcome to the Subsidence Forum's training day in 2021. My name is Sarah Dodd. I'm the current chair of the Subsidence Forum, and I'm delighted to welcome you all this morning, whether you're joining us live or whether you're watching us back on playback. So this is the first of 3 sessions that will be going ahead this month on a Friday morning. So it's a normal Zoom session, so I think we're all really familiar with Zoom now. There is the Q&A box, and do feel free to interact with questions. I'm going to be monitoring the Q&A box, and I can fire those questions to the speakers at the end of the session. There's the chat box as well, so do feel free to interact in that in terms of the chat. The session is being recorded, so it can be watched back on playback. It will be uploaded onto the Subsidence Forum's LinkedIn page, the website, and also on our brand new YouTube channel. So definitely look out for that. That's super exciting. Before we start, there is the Competition Act Declaration, which is up on your screens there. If you could have a quick read of that and remind yourself of all that entails. And I think enough from me. I think we're interested in hearing what the speakers have got to say. There I am. So I will hand over now to Patrick Isaacs, who is our Training and Education Interest Group Head. Over to you, Patrick.
Thanks, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. Many thanks for joining in. I understand we have over 200 people logged on today, which is fantastic. So welcome to our training day. We're much more used to having a traditional sort of in-person day or demonstration day as we've had in recent years, but obviously we can't put on something like that at the moment. So we hope these webinars, these virtual days will fill the gap. The webinars have proved very popular and perhaps opened up the forum to some new members from different disciplines, which is very welcome indeed. And with that in mind, there is a survey at the end of the webinar. We'd be very grateful if you could just take a couple of minutes to fill that in. That will help us decide what we need to do next year in terms of topics and format. So yeah, when you log off, that should pop up. So it would be a great help if you could take the time to fill that in. So as Sarah said, this is the first of 3 webinars that we're running, and we have some fantastic presentations from NHBC and Abbey Pynford coming right up. The next webinar is next Friday, 9 to 10, same time, and features DAC Beechcroft talking about a new bit of legislation, the Environment Act, and how that's going to impact on the subsidence industry. Then we have a superb video demonstration from Catalyst Claims, showing us how they investigate and repair underground drainage. And I can say it's superb because I've already seen it, and it's certainly worth a watch. The final webinar is the Friday after that, 15th of October, and we have a talk from PRI, that's Property Risk Inspections, about statutory tree protection. And then finally, to close the event, we have a session from InsurTech Insights about building your brand and social media. Just one point, please remember that you have to register for each event separately. Just because you registered today doesn't automatically mean you registered for the next 2 events. You have to do each one individually. So if you haven't done that yet, please do it before next Friday. As Sarah said, if you have any questions, and I'm sure there'll be lots, please submit these via the chat function. We'll go through these at the end of both presentations, time permitting, and come up with some answers. Anything that we don't get to, we will collate and post some answers on the Subs Forum website, where you can also see a recording of this webinar. And we will be finished by 10 o'clock on the dot today. So let's press on with the first presentation, and I'm delighted to introduce Richard Smith, the Head of Standards, Innovation and Research at the NHBC. Sounds like you got 3 jobs there, Richard.
Yes.
He's going to give us some insight into subsidence and the foundation issues that they experience. So thank you very much, Richard.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. Just to go through, and thanks for having me. It's good to be here. Just want to give a bit of an overview of the presentation. First, I'm just going to give some general information about the house building industry, how it's sort of going on, and some numbers, and then go into some claims experience, and then talk about what we're doing moving forward on the foundation front, really, in relation to foundation systems and our standards. So that's the overview, and obviously happy to take questions at the end. So move on to the next slide, please. So just to look at the market data, obviously last year with COVID, we had quite a drop in Q2 2020, but the registrations on the last quarter have been substantially high, and higher, well, the highest figure since 2007, which is encouraging. Of those, the majority are private sector new homes. But we have seen a number of social housing properties as well that's been registered. We've also seen that the actual number of completions is bouncing back quite well as well, which is encouraging, because it's not just showing that the starts are healthy, but the properties are complete, which shows a healthy market. If we move on to the next slide, we'll see that actually most of the properties that are coming through to NHBC for warranty are generally detached and semi-detached dwellings, and that's because a lot of core businesses with major house builders that are building that kind of sector. We do have a high number of apartments coming through, but you'll see that bungalows are very low, and it seems to be that there's not a massive either demand or an appetite by developers to build bungalows. And you can see on the scale, it's significantly smaller. So that's just to give you a bit of an indication of the split. And if we move on to the next slide, that will show the rate of completions. And again, it was no surprise to us that in Q2 2020 that we saw a significant reduction in completions, and that was because most housing sites either slowed right down or stopped due to COVID. But again, you can see that that's really bounced back really well, and we have seen some significant lifts on completions, including Q4 in 2020, where it was particularly busy. And just to give a bit of scale on what we do at NHBC, typically we will carry out 20,000 inspections a week or thereabouts, so somewhere between 18 and 22, depending on the time of year and the peak. So it's quite a busy time, and there's a lot going on. So that's some stats to share with you. But if we just move on to the next slide, I would like to spend more time there to talk to you about our claims and our claims experience with buildings. And thankfully, I can say that we don't seem to have a significant claims loss with foundations and foundation systems, but we still get some claims. And you'll see that statistically, well, I'll split this down between 2017 and 2020, that most of our claims come from strip and trench fill foundations or building near trees. We do receive some claims on raft and pile beam systems and land quality and some ground improvement, but they are very, very few and far between. So it's the traditional building systems or traditional foundation systems, and also where we're building near trees that we actually receive the notifications. And just to say that these are claims, this is notifications that we've received rather than actually the costs. And if we move on to the next slide, we'll now talk about costs. So if you remember on the last slide, we looked at strip and trench fill foundations as being the largest, if like, notifier of claims. But from a cost point of view, building near trees and remediating building near trees is probably more expensive over that similar time. And just to clarify there that I think that's down to the fact that actually the foundation systems are more complex and probably more complex to resolve, and where perhaps we may have an issue with a strip and trench fill foundation that may not always necessarily rely on an underpinning solution. A solution for remediating foundations near trees may include a pile draft reinforcement sort of system or something like that, which obviously increases the cost significantly. Just to also say that in recent times, we claims that we have seen. Good example, I saw one recently where the foundation depths were what we would deem as adequate, but the heave protection was missing. So there was potentially a risk of heave in that building. But you know, what we generally see is that our standards in relation to building near trees generally in terms, if done correctly, is appropriate for our risk. So from that point of view, and just to put a figure on that, that figure of those claims over those 4 to 5 years is around sort of 8 to 10 million, which sounds a lot, but you know, based on the scale of what we cover, it is sort of you know, it's not too bad a claim risk or loss ratio. It's something that we want to look at as we move forward. So if we move on to the next slide. So just to talk about what we are doing at NHBC to look at foundations. Well, for a start off, we are committed to supporting changes to prevent further climate change and resilience to climate change. And we have recently, well, previously produced an NHBC Foundation publication on designing efficient piling systems for low-rise housing, and that was done a number of years ago now. What we have agreed to do now is we are looking at, well, we have commissioned a new NHBC Foundation publication to look at the effects of climate change and how that will affect foundations in the future. We've started on that. That will involve a technical survey, which you know, if anyone is interested, please contact me, and we can put that over to our authors, and we can get that out. But I think getting the information across to actually do the survey so we can find out the scale and develop that would be really good. But from there, the idea would be is that we would look at then what that foundation report is telling us, to look how we are going to then put in future standards for NHBC to support climate change, and look at how we can improve our resilience to climate change and risk of movement within foundation systems. So just to give an update, we are expecting the publication to be released sort of mid next year. We're in the very early stages and the very early commission on that. So that's where we are. So as we move on to the next slide, as part of our climate change sort of agenda, we recognise that more trees will be planted on sites, and we support that. And I think it's very clear to say that we support that, and we recognise that that is part of a good sustainability agenda. And it's also, we recognise that some local authorities, High Wycombe for example, are already starting to put planning conditions in about the percentage of tree canopy on building sites. But that also represents a risk to NHBC. And with respect to that, we have to look at how we are resilient to that risk. So rather than NHBC saying that we do not support trees, additional trees and tree canopies or enlarged tree canopies going on sites, what we'd sooner do is work with the industry to look at how we can mitigate that risk and reduce the potential risk of buildings becoming of risk of subsidence. based on the fact there are more trees there. So for that reason, we have offered some support to the Trees Design Action Group, and we are happy to contribute to their technical publications. And we have contributed some financial support on that as well. And I hope that demonstrates that we're not just focused on mitigating our own risk by not looking at other areas, but we do feel as though that there are significant factors that we have to consider with trees to ensure that our buildings are resilient going forward. Next slide, please. So probably one of the most interesting areas for today is the foundation depth calculator. We don't have any immediate plans to change the foundation depth calculator as of today, but hopefully you can see that with the research that we're doing as part of our NHBC Foundation publication and the work we're doing with TDAG, is that as part of that process, one of the outcomes would be that we would look at our standards in general terms, chapter 4.2, and look whether we need to make changes to improve our resilience as we move forward, especially with climate change. We recognise that shrinkability or plasticity of clay varies significantly throughout the UK. The south and southeast been more at risk to more shrinkage and movement in the clay. But also we also recognise that with potentially dry summers and wetter winters, the research we want to carry out is actually hopefully will tell us what impact that will have on potential foundation systems. And the other thing that we need to look at is the fact that actually we are at NHBC, we need to consider the embodied carbon of foundation systems. And I don't think that we want to be an organisation or business that continues to tell people to put lots of concrete into the ground because it's not probably the most sustainable solution for a foundation system. So that is the other aspect there, is that we will consider the environmental impact of the type of foundation systems that NHBC standards would require to mitigate the risk when we're building near trees. And with that in mind, that would, without actually discussing or coming to a solution yet, because we're not there yet, that could potentially mean that the foundation depth calculator, as it currently forms, may have more limitations. Not because it doesn't perform as it is, but mainly because we don't want it to be something that's a system that actually puts more embodied carbon into buildings. So that's where we are with that. Anticipated dates for change. We are just looking at a structure and a mapping exercise with our standards and climate change, and we're going to prioritise the various sections. The outcome of the NHBC Foundation publication to talk about risk will actually sort of drive where that fits in there. So I haven't got a date yet, but I'm guessing that within the next 2 to 3 years we will start to look at this and go forward with that. Move on to the next slide. So just the key thing for me really is we haven't really had, in my experience, much of a relationship with the Subsidence Forum, and that's why I'm glad I'm here really. But we do recognise that the NHBC Standard 4.2 is used for remediation schemes and for underpinning schemes. I suppose what I would say here is that NHBC Standard 4.2 is a standard to demonstrate compliance with NHBC requirements for new build housing. It was never produced or prepared for anything wider than that, as far as I'm aware. But we do recognise that it's used by the wider industry. From an NHBC point of view, I've got to make it clear that I don't think that was ever the intention, and I would say that from our priority will always be to create a standard for providing resilience to potential claims and consumer experience in new build housing. So what I would say though is that I am happy for the Subsidence Forum to be involved in any future committees that we set up in relation to developing future standards with respect to foundations, particularly standard 4.2 and foundations near trees. So that's probably an open invite to the Subsidence Forum to say to get involved, and I'm more than happy to obtain the feedback from the Subsidence Forum to help develop a good standard. So next slide, please. So, and this is just another part that I want to talk to you about with NHBC Foundation. We complete publications to help the industry evolve, learn, and sort of pave the way for things that could be in the future. We've carried out a lot of research publications on modern methods of construction, renewables, and we will carry out a number of publications to help introduce the Future Home Standards, which is the government's proposal for improving energy efficiency in dwellings and switching from non-fossil fuels to a more of a sustainable fuel source, which is going to be electric. So, for example, we've carried out a number of publications on car charging points, heat pumps, but also alongside that, we will do complete publications that are a little bit more diverse. And one is the biodiversity publication. And this is to help developers achieve good levels of biodiversity on building sites and hopefully provide some consistency across sites and across planning conditions, for example. In line with that, we are also working quite closely with the HBF and the New Homes Delivery Hub. And the New Homes Delivery Hub is basically a company entity set up to support developers in achieving the Future Home Standards requirements in a positive way, but also to help improve the resilience against climate change, which includes embodied carbon. And we have a suite of publications that actually help with that. Some of the publications we've got, as we mentioned just now, we're looking at the NHBC Foundation publication. We're also looking at a publication, or in progress in developing a publication that looks at ground gases and building practically with ground gas issues on sites, especially where there's more of an emphasis to increase insulation to ground floors. And by doing that, there is a risk that the ground gas contamination measures may be compromised a little bit. So we're doing work on that. And we're also doing a publication to talk about we'll call them unintended consequences, but the risks associated with building to new energy standards. So that's the sort of direction we're looking at, but we're starting with the foundations first and going upwards and tackling that there. And that's my update. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I'm happy to take questions at the end of this session this morning. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That's very enlightening. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions for you at the end, so please keep them coming in, either via the Q&A button or the chat button. We can pick them up from both, but yeah, keep them coming in and we'll catch up with those at the end. So thanks very much, Richard. I'll now move on to our second presentation this morning. And I'm pleased to introduce Matthew Newis, Head of Special Projects at Abbey Pynford. And for those of you who don't know, Abbey Pynford are a specialist underpinning ground engineering contractor, members of ASUC, and Matthew is going to tell us all about tile graft repairs, what it means, and how they work. So over to you, Matthew. Thank you.
Try again. Good morning. As Patrick said, I'm Matthew. I'm Head of Special Projects at Abbey Pynford, and my team look after the underpinning elements of the work we undertake. If you go to the next slide, Chloe, please. Underpinning. What is it? Well, there's a lot of different descriptions out there, but that's underpins the process of constructing a new foundation beneath an existing foundation or strengthening an existing foundation without affecting the stability of the structure. There are a variety of different techniques of underpinning out there, but today we're going to concentrate on piled raft underpinning. If you go to the next slide, please, Chloe. Construction of piled raft. We often, when we go out and see people, get asked, what are you actually doing to our house? We have quite a basic description of doing it, which in simple terms is putting a building on a concrete table, which is the raft slab, with concrete or steel legs. That gives the owner a sort of picture of what we're doing. It's most appropriate for whole buildings or extensions if we can, but it's good to pick up a whole building. It's more cost effective than traditional underpinning, and the raft slab also doubles up as a new floor structure. We can use it for anti-heave, and it's easier to adapt and adjust. The downside, to be honest, is the disturbance. At the end of the day, the whole of the inside of the property gets stripped out. So the property needs to be vacated when we carry out the works. If we go to the next picture, Chloe. I'm going to run through the process. So generally, we work alongside a general building contractor who will strip out the property and protect it. They'll take out all the fixtures and fittings on the ground floor. Sometimes, if there's something that needs to be kept, we'll work around it, build underneath it, but ideally the whole ground floor gets stripped out. That includes non-load bearing partitions, and the existing floor gets removed and reduced. Sometimes undertaken by the main contractor, or sometimes ourselves. If you go to the next slide, please. First thing we carry out generally is the piling. When you talk to people about piling, generally everyone thinks about the big piling rigs you see out on the big open sites. And then the first question that I get asked by the homeowner is, well, how do you do that? How do you get one of them in our house? Well, what we do is we bring in something that's a much more scaled down version. Something similar to the rigs in the pictures there. Or similar bits of kit. There's two pictures on there that show augured rigs, and then in the top right hand corner that was a handheld set kit that was set on scaffold to install actual micropiles, which I'll talk about later. If you go to the next slide, please, Chloe. So here's a number of pictures of piles that have been installed at different stages. Piles installed, usually it's installed and it comes out just above ground level. We use cardboard sleeves to build them up, and the reinforcement projects out the top, which is then bent down and put into the raft slab. Just go to the next slide, please. Once all the piles are installed, we'll support the building on temporary stalls. These then continue to support the building through the existing foundation whilst the raft slab's installed. On some occasions, the foundation might not be deep enough for us to stall off of it, so we may insert temporary foundations below or use pad stones. If you go to the next slide. Once it's stooled up, we'll put the blinding in. Usually sand or concrete. Concrete's used if we've got no anti-heave precautions, or if we're using, say, polystyrene, such as Peckerfill or Celcor. Sand, we generally use if we're using the collapsible materials, such as heave guard or clayboard. If you go to the next picture. Depending on what we're using, the clayboard material is actually made out of cardboard. We wrap it up. In its dry state, all wrapped up, it can support up to a metre's worth of concrete above it. So we install that, we install the concrete, and then afterwards we introduce water into it, which allows it to collapse and create a heave void underneath. The polystyrene products work slightly different, is that they are compressed. If the ground heaves, they're designed to actually compress. They require for us to make sure that the pile connections are a lot stronger and the piles are designed accordingly to resist that uplift. Go to the next slide. Once we've got the anti-heave in, we'll install the reinforcement. All the reinforcement is placed in, and then prior to concrete in, we'll have quality control checks, generally by our contracts managers, by building control, potentially checking engineers or the clerk of works. As we're members of AZUC, we'll also potentially have design, depending on the size of the project, engineers that check on behalf of AZUC to come in and have a look as well. Once we've got the reinforcement already, if we go to the next slide, we'll pour the concrete. Generally, need access to either get a concrete lorry up to the site or we'll pump it. Once the concrete's all installed, we'll allow it to go off. We'll allow the concrete to go off, and then after 7 days, we'll then look if we need to take the temporary stalls out. So if you go to the next slide, Chloe. So we take the stalls out and the holes are made good. And the process of removing the stalls, we have further quality checks to make sure that they've been all been removed, and then the building at that stage is separated from the existing foundation. On some occasions, we may need some bricking up done, as in the lower picture. So the slab's installed. Before we take the stalls out, we'll either dry pack the gap between the existing structure and our slab, or if it's over 75 millimeters, we'll get it bricked up. Okay, if you go to the next picture, Chloe. So I've got a couple of case studies. So the first one being on the next page, a large property that we did in North London. This property had been previously underpinned and piled, but was still moving quite considerably. So we prepared and provided a quite detailed scheme that then that had some quite complex temporary works, which allowed us to take out the sections of the existing scheme so we could put a whole new scheme in. Let's go to the next page. The piling rigs, as I said, they're designed to go in the building. And as you can see here, they'll fit through doorways, they'll fit through a domestic doorway. And by the time the floor's removed, they've got sufficient height to operate without damaging the ceiling, etc. If you carry on, as they work through, the guys then stooled up the building, breaking out bits of the existing structure and putting it all on the temporary stalls. Sometimes we have to take the drainage out and put it back in again, depending where the piles are going, and on another occasion it actually might need to be moved or combined within the actual scheme that we're installing. Let's go to the next page. So as you can see, as we progress through the works, piles are installed, then the blinding, the anti-heave precautions all wrapped up, and then the slab finally installed. That was a traditional scheme that we did, which was down to clay shrinkage. This project was a new build property that we had to go in and pile. It was timber frame, so that threw up its own issues because of how to support the timber frame. We came up with a quite a novel approach, and we installed lintels underneath that entire frame with our props to ensure that the loads weren't, that we didn't have point loads being put into the sole plate. On this scheme, it was a non-voided scheme, so we didn't have to put the anti-heave precautions in. So the stalls actually get cast in and are sacrificial. If you go to the next page. This property that we did down in Sussex, it was a bit different. It was 2 rear projections in a terrace, and the ground was very poor. The issue we had was how we actually got piling rigged to the rear. The road level was 1 story up, so we installed a micropile solution here. We got specialists in to do the micropiles, but we also did it back to front. We actually installed the raft slab first. Because of the state of the property, the rear projections were rotating away quite significantly, which you can see from the cracking. We installed quite a comprehensive shoring system at the rear to prop it up, to hold the building there, whilst we then put the temporary support in. Go to the next page. We actually stalled the slab up, stalled the building up off of pad stones and off temporary pads, and then actually installed the raft slab first. Because the property had such a shallow nominal footing, we put the whole raft slab in first, and we left openings in the slab to allow us to install the piles afterwards. Okay, go to the next page. This is slightly different project for us. This was for a house builder where we stabilised not only the existing structures, we also installed pile rafts for new foundations over some of the buildings. It shows that we can, not only we can do single story, 2-story standard domestic properties, but we can engineer to take up much larger structures. So we underpinned not only the manor house here, we underpinned the stable block and the clock tower as well. Using similar techniques, just using thicker slabs, larger diameter piles, and more comprehensive stalling techniques. If you carry on. So we picked up the manor house, which is in the bottom left-hand corner. We picked up the stable blocks, and we picked up the clock tower with pile rafts. We also did some facade retention and mass concrete underpinning to the listed wall at the rear. And the new homes at the back of the site, we also put on our house deck system, which is a piled raft for new build properties. If you carry on, Chloe. So in the manor house, we stalled it up. We put quite comprehensive stalls into some of the areas, which comprise large steel sections on temporary pad stones. The main contractor did quite a lot of temporary propping to hold the structure in place. And as we carry on, we picked up the clock tower. This was a very large, heavily loaded structure. But again, our design team did FE modelling on it, looked at it, and came up with a solution that worked, that provided them so the house builder with a new foundation, so they could convert this. If you carry on, please. The stables, rose garden wall, as I've said, and the new build slabs at the back. This pictures of our house deck crews putting together our house deck systems. Piles go in, and then we put a slab in on top, ready for the new houses to be built. If you carry on. So we carry out a lot of our own designs. Piling has come a long way in the last 15 years. Before, piling rigs didn't have the big red cage that you see there on the front of it, whereas now we do. It makes it more difficult to where we put our piles. Doesn't mean that we always have to have that guard on there. There are ways of working around it. It's those right down. We have to like make exclusion zones. But predominantly what it's done is it's made it so we can't work as close to the building as we used to. So we've had to redevelop our designs and reconsider what we do. What you'll find is that most underpinners design and install their underpinning their own way. They all have little nuances and they all do it themselves. Quite a lot of the time, clients go out to engineers to get these designed first. Generally, if you don't involve an underpinning contractor that knows how close you can put the piling rig, what the problems are going to be, the scheme ends up getting adapted and designed at that stage. So a lot of our work we do on a design and build basis. People come to us with a performance specification and we work to that. I think a lot of the time, a lot of this, if the engineers don't involve us, you could spend quite a bit of money that's going to then need to be redesigned anyway. The HSC are quite keen and adamant about the use of guarding and about prosecuting people if not. It was to pick up on that there have been accidents on sites with piling rigs. So it has brought us forward. It has made things safer. Just means that we need to spend more time designing out the issues. Okay, that's the end. So about us, we're based in Luton. We have our in-house design teams, and we also have our own plant hire business. So we actually own all our own piling rigs, which we also then hire out as well. Okay, next slide, please, Clay. So we have a number of divisions. We have house deck, com deck. We have tree safe solutions. If people want to build very close to trees where you can't put the larger rigs, you need to look at different working processes. And then we have our underpinning division, which part of special projects. And as I said, we have Pynford piling services, which we do our own plant hire, servicing, fabrication and repair. Okay, next slide, Clay. So we're IMS accredited. Our systems are BBA and LABC certified. We have CHAS and SMAS accredited construction line, and our systems are to the NHBC and Premier Warranty approved systems. That's generally our house foundation systems. Okay. We've worked for a lot of people. We do a lot of insurance work. We do a lot of work for the house builders and their ground workers. And we get involved with as much as we can. Okay, we have our in-house design teams. So we do all our work in-house. FE modeling, we've done some quite complicated and detailed things in the past. We use a lot of 2D and 3D software, Sophistick, etc., to do our designs. So that's the end. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Matthew. That was really interesting. Loads of great photos there, which I'm sure has given everybody a little insight into what it actually looks like on the ground in a property being underpinned. I've been checking out the chat box and the Q&A box as you two have been going through. Richard, if you want to come on your camera as well, because I'll start with some questions to you, if that's okay.
Yeah, can you see me?
I can see you, yeah.
Yep,
All right, hang on. Let me just scroll back to the beginning of the questions there. So from Giles Carter, he said, it noted that it was never the intention of the NHBC that Chapter 4.2 would be adopted by the wider building control and subsidence market, but what alternative design guides could building control and the subsidence market rely on, in your opinion?
Okay, so what I would say is the best route for any foundation system would be to be engineered designed. So I would say that is the preferred route, and that would be the route for that, to go down an engineered solution rather than a set of standard design guides. I'm aware of ours. I believe that LABC may have a foundation depth calculator as well, but that is the general approach. That would be a design solution.
Yeah, I think that other depth calculator was mentioned in one of the Q&As. There's one here which is more an observation on a previous claim. So this is coming in from John Buckley, who says that he had a subsidence claim on a property in Chorley. It was a tree root clay shrinkage claim, and a previous owner had made a claim against the NHBC and received a cash settlement. The property was then sold on to a builder who did some basic repairs and sold the property on to the new owner, so the policyholder that he was working for. This was never identified by the conveyancing solicitor. Is there anything in place to stop this type of thing occurring and to make this transaction more easily identifiable?
Oh, that's a good question. There's quite an ethical piece there, isn't there? In the sense that at NHBC we fulfilled our obligation by agreeing to the claim and making a settlement. Normally or typically, we would look at what is the best option for the policyholder and NHBC in those scenarios. And on that case, and I don't know the case, but I assume that was an agreement. The cash settlement is made with the intention that the work will be carried out and repaired, and for that reason we have paid out. And I'm going to make a similar sort of comparison. If there's a car incident and a car is written off and the insurer pays out for a new car, it doesn't necessarily mean that the owner of the previous car buys a new car. That's very difficult for us to police and manage. I would suggest as part of the conveyancing process, and it depends on the depth of the conveyancing process. There's different levels of home buyer surveys, for example. I would like to have thought if there was any form of subsidence or movement that would have been picked up as part of a survey process. Yeah. But if it's a cash purchase, then there's no requirement to have a survey as such. And you know, minimum surveys is for lendability rather than the actual, you know, the overall condition of a property.
Yeah, and I know as part of the conveyancing process, and although I'm a lawyer, conveyancing isn't my area, but you should, as the seller of a property, disclose previous subsidence damage. I think as part of the seller's property information forms. The fact that you don't do that, if you don't do that whilst totally being aware of the fact that you should be doing it, then as the vendor of the property, you could certainly be in some contractual trouble there anyway. Let me see if I can find a couple in the Q&A box a second. Let me just scroll back. So a question here from Sue James. Richard, do you think there will or can be change into building regulations approved document A in line with changes to chapter 4.2?
Right, okay, that again is an interesting question, because I do sit on the Building Regulations Advisory Committee, and it feels like every regulation at the moment is up for change, mainly down to future home standards and fire. But I've not seen any proposals as yet with regards to Part A and approved document A and structure. And I think we've got to be realistic about what approved document A is, and it's a very limited document for low-rise housing of masonry construction with a strip foundation that recommends minimum depths, and that's all it is. And anything outside of that should be engineered designed. So, for example, timber frame, the structure of timber frame doesn't fit within the guidance of approved document A. It still has to meet the requirement of Part A in the regulations, as in the building shall basically be structurally sound and stable, and also the requirement of I think it's A2 about loadings is about the requirement about transferring the loads of the building safely into the ground or in the ground. So approved document A is one method of doing that, and that one method is in my view is in a very restricted area of low-rise masonry, and anything over that is outside of the approved document and should be therefore designed.
Thank you.
So I can't see it changing straight away on that basis.
There's another one in here. Your talk has obviously really got a lot of interest here, Richard. So there's another question in here from Fraser Galloway. Is there an interaction with NHBC and the local authorities building control in giving advice and training for signing off new structures? Some inspectors still seem to operate on the basis of signing off foundation depths in line with root depth found, rather than using NHBC guidance, or do not check if there is an anti-heave measure in place.
Right, okay, yeah, interesting question. So LABC is a member organisation of local authority building control departments. We do have a relationship with LABC, and we do work together, I think, quite proactively. But if you imagine that we're talking about the individual competency of building control officers. Now, this is probably not necessarily something that's on our radar, but there are professional organisations out there that building control officers will be part of, such as Chartered Association of Building Engineers, CIAB, RSCS maybe, that do provide CPD and training in building regulation matters, and I'm aware that they do provide sort of CPD and events in those kind of areas for building control. It's again, I'm going to go back to the one thing I think that should happen is that I don't think it's a building control officer's decision to determine whether the foundation solution is correct. Okay, I think it's down to the applicant who makes the building regulations application to demonstrate compliance with the building regulations, and the building control surveyor, regardless if it's public or private sector, inspect to ensure compliance. And I think that sometimes there's a reliance on the building control surveyor to go out on site, identify a tree, and work with the builder to come up with a solution. And I think that is probably a little bit fair on the building control surveyor, because they're looking at fire, they're looking at thermal, they're looking at everything else throughout the build process, and they are not structural engineers. They cover all the aspects. So I think for me the key thing is I'd support building control surveyors to say, you have got a tree in the garden, the foundations as designed on the details provided have not indicated that tree, you need to go back to your design team to come up with a solution, would be the more proactive way in my view.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'll just ask some of the questions now to Matthew, if that's okay. Matthew, if you want to come back on your camera. I noticed that I think there are a couple of questions, Matthew, which were the same, one in the Q&A box and one in the chat box. One about, is the rebar and the slab you showed designed to BS 8110 or greater?
Usually we design to BS 8110 or potentially EC2 if it's a project requirement, but usually it's 8110.
Right, thank you. And then Sue James raised a question about the timber frame building. So it's the new build timber frame. What's caused that problem in the first place?
It had foundation failure. So we were brought in to pick it up. We managed to install our new pile rafting over the top of the existing foundation that had been installed.
Okay, and another one in from Sue, who was obviously listening carefully. And Matthew, when you resolve the problem for one house and a terrace, does it cause problems for adjacent properties which might be okay, but on the shallow foundations? Actually, it's interesting because I've had a similar conversation to this in the last week or so.
It depends on how. In underpinning one in a terrace, you potentially are creating a hard spot. It's how you then put movement joints in to accommodate the structures that haven't been underpinned to move in relative to the one that has been underpinned. Because all buildings will move slightly to some extent. However, if you've got one that's now been fully underpinned and the rest of the terrace hasn't, there is a possibility of differential movement occurring. So it's more about making sure that the interface between the non-underpinned and underpinned sections have been detailed correctly.
Great. Okay, and then probably one of our final questions on money. So Giles Carter asks, what's a typical budget cost for a pile draft underpin per square metre?
It's a hard question to ask. Do you mean for overall, to include the building cost as well, or just the underpinning element? We generally just deal with the underpinning element, and rough cost anywhere between £700 to £1,000 probably a square metre. It does vary depending on the type of pile that you're going to install, and again, how much responsibility that we're taking. As a rule of thumb, I used to, before I worked back with Abbey Pynford, so I worked for a remedial works contractor that managed the whole job, and the underpinning cost usually was in the region of about 40% of the overall cost of the works.
Right,
it's quite difficult to actually go, all right, put a rule of thumb, it's going to cost that much straight off, but somewhere between £700 to £1,000 square metre.
Okay, and before we sign off, I've got one question from Andy Tipping that I can probably put to both of you, actually. If piled foundations are to become more common in the future, does that mean that trees close to a building will no longer be a constraint on design, and that with central government targets for new street trees in all new build estates, we should no longer have major considerations for trees close to buildings?
Well, okay, yeah, well, for me, what we should be looking at is proactively promoting trees closer to buildings, but at the same time then having the appropriate foundation solution to deal with that. Okay, so that is, so the two go hand in hand. So the design has to mitigate the risk of that tree adjacent to the building, and at the same time we have to be proactive to increasing tree canopies on sites. So the two go hand in glove, in my view. You can't just say that, because even with the pile foundation system, there will be some additional measures, I'm guessing, that would be required to deal with the heave aspect of enclaves in particular, because you are planting trees next to or closer to buildings, and that is to me one of the most important parts. So yeah, the two go hand in glove.
Thank you, Richard. Matthew, any comments you want to make on that one?
From the pile foundation point, yes, you've just got to then make sure that you've incorporated the heave voids, if we're working in cohesive soils, underneath the slab, and the piles are designed to suit.
Great, thank you. Well, I've done my very best to deal with the chat box, the Q&As and the chat that have come in. So if I've missed anybody's questions, then please accept my apologies. We will review any that didn't get answered, and we will submit some answers back for you. I will hand over to Patrick, I think, but before I do, I'd just like to say thank you for joining us on our first session. I'm talking at the next session, so obviously please feel free to sign up to that and dial in, talking about the Environment Act. That should be really interesting, and also totally dovetails with Richard's comments today about obviously the environmental agenda and the things that are changing at the moment, hot topics. Sorry, over to you, Patrick.
Yeah, Yeah, thanks very much, Sarah, and obviously thanks to Richard and Matthew. That was absolutely fantastic. I get the impression we could have carried on there talking about trees, foundation design, and NHBC 4.2, but time's against us. So yeah, it's just a massive thank you to all the presenters. Virtual round of applause. Very well done. Chloe has been recording this webinar, which will be posted on the Subs Forum website in due course. And as Sarah mentioned, we'll try and catch up any questions that have been missed. Just a final reminder for next Friday, same time, same place, 9 o'clock start. And don't forget to register and tell all your friends and colleagues to do likewise. So 10 o'clock on the dot. Thank you all for joining. Look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.